All right, so this will be chapter 13, as long as here we go. So now we're going to start looking at genetics. Okay, so we're looking at how are traits passed from parents then to offspring. Okay, and so we typically see that children look somewhat like their parents, but this isn't always true. Sometimes we get children that aren't an exact mix, and some traits show up and cover up others. And so we'll look at all of these various things that we see within inheritance. We've got a lot of terminology here when we're talking about inheritance. A lot of these are probably new words, and so you'll just have to study what each of these means. And as we're going through this chapter, we will hit every one of these terms. Okay, so inheritance is the process where we're passing on characteristics, traits from parents to offspring. And these characteristics are held in the genes of our chromosomes. So we talked about in meiosis how these chromosomes separate from one another and then they'll end up in different gametes. And then through fertilization, you get random genes from mom, random genes or chromosomes from dad. And then they mix together more or less, and we get a new set of traits. Okay? So a gene is a location on a chromosome that codes for a protein. Okay, so a gene is that set of DNA that through the process of transcription is going to get turned into messenger RNA. And then through translation, we're going to build a protein. And that protein is going to carry out some function to display a trait or a characteristic, whatever it might be. So we've got variant forms of genes, right? Not all genes have the exact same form. That's why we're all so different from one another. Okay. And so these different or alternate forms of the same gene are known as alleles. Okay. So these are found at the exact same place on the same chromosome. So here we've got chromosome 13, and this is BRCA2. That's a healthy gene. And then we've got the same gene here on chromosome 13, BRCA2, but this is one that predisposes you to breast cancer. So same gene, BRCA2, but there's some difference here in the nucleotide strand. And so they're different versions of the same gene. We refer to them as alleles. So here we've got fish odor syndrome. This is one I'm sure most people are thankful that they don't have if they don't have it. But we've got that gene here, FMO3 from mom in the egg cell in this chromosome 1. Then we've got the gene from dad. You can tell this is illustrating that it's different. Okay, there's different chain of nucleotides, whatever. It's going to code for a different protein in the end. You get your fertilization, and now you have this child, which is now diploid, with these two different forms of this gene, two different alleles. Now, this child is going to be fine because, as we'll talk about later, some genes are dominant, some genes are recessive. But if this child had two of the defective genes, he'd have this fish odor syndrome and would produce a smell that most people would not find very alluring. Okay. So, how do we look at and then predict the outcome of pairings between parents and what their offspring are going to end up with? Okay, so we use symbols to represent different variants of a gene. Typically, this is going to be uppercase letter if an allele is dominant, and a lowercase letter for an allele if it's recessive. And I talk about this in the Punnett square and genetic cross practice videos. So you should take a look at those as well if you haven't yet. Okay. So looking at single gene traits, because they're the simplest to look at to start with, we've got some alleles for hairline on chromosome 8, and this is a pretty easy one to see if you have. We've got alleles for having a widow's peak. So here we've got Leonardo down here, and you can see that his hairline comes to a point. We call that a widow's peak. Then we've got this guy who I know I've seen on TV but can't remember his name. He's got a straight hairline, and that's going to be the recessive trait. So the widow's peak, we use that capital W because it's dominant. The straight hairline is recessive, so we use that little w. And we'll talk about what those things mean here in a little bit. Okay, but this widow's peak gene is located in the same location on both of these chromosomes, but we've got some difference between them, so they are alleles. Okay, so if we've got the same allele on both chromosomes, this individual is referred to as homozygous. Okay, the prefix homo means same. Okay, so we could have an individual that is homozygous dominant, where they have two dominant alleles, as we see here with this widow's peak shown, two big W's, they're homozygous dominant. An individual can be homozygous recessive, as we see with the A's here in our image. We've got two little a's, so they've got two of the recessive traits, and they're the same allele. And then you can also be heterozygous. The prefix hetero means different. Sometimes these are referred to as hybrids. What this means, if they're heterozygous, is their alleles are different. Okay, so in this case, they've got a dominant allele and a recessive allele. This is the language that we'll be using throughout this whole chapter. Okay, we'll talk about homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. I won't typically say little a, little a. Okay, sometimes I might if we're working a Punnett square though. Okay, so then we get into these two other terms. Okay, and we'll talk about these, and when we're looking at creating offspring and what potential offspring a pairing would have, we'll talk about phenotype ratios and genotype ratios. So the phenotype is the actual physical expression of that gene. So what do they look like? In the case here with Leonardo DiCaprio, the phenotype is the widow's peak. He shows that he's got the widow's peak. The genotype are the actual combination of alleles. So what are the actual alleles that this individual has? Now, just looking at Leonardo here, we don't know, because he could be homozygous dominant and have a widow's peak, or he could be heterozygous and have a widow's peak. Okay, so we don't explicitly know without a little bit more information what his genotype is, but the phenotype, piece of cake. You look at the physical expression and you know. Okay, so dominant alleles are ones that are expressed. All you have to have is one of that allele to have that phenotype. So in the case here, as I just talked about with Leonardo, he could be homozygous dominant, that big W, or heterozygous, the big W, little w. And both of these genotypes are going to lead to the widow's peak phenotype. With recessive traits, you can only have the recessive phenotype if the individual is homozygous recessive. So they have to have both recessive alleles in order to have that recessive phenotype. So in order to have a straight hairline, you have to be homozygous recessive. Okay. Now we talked about this in meiosis, where we get this independent assortment of chromosomes, and they just kind of divide themselves up randomly. Okay. And so we can look at Gregor Mendel, who's often referred to as the father of genetics. A lot of his studies really led to how we understand inheritance at the basic level. Okay. He was a Czech monk in the 1800s, worked on pea plants. Okay. You may have heard of him before. His experiments were pretty straightforward. The pea is great to study because you can fertilize a pea plant with its own pollen. Pea plants are true breeding. Okay, so we can get these strains that always produce the same offspring, and you can easily cross-fertilize. Okay, he worked with one trait at a time, did seed shape, seed color, pod shape, pod color, and so on, looking at all of these things. We'll continue looking into Mendel's work in the next video.